what is Catholic philosophy? When many people think of Catholic philosophy, they think it is philosophy that is designed to defend the Catholic faith. This isn't necessarily true. If we designed our philosophy to defend the faith, then really we're just using circular reasoning to defend the faith. Catholic philosophy is philosophy that sees the world as it really is. So when we see the world as it really is, we see the mind of God. Just like by looking at an artist and the work of an artist, you can understand what's in the mind of the artist. When we look at the world and God's creation, we can get a little glimpse into the mind and desire of God. Now this is really done through the philosophy of metaphysics and philosophy of nature. The view that metaphysics and philosophy of nature view what is really there is called realism. This idea of realism says that if man sees something, what he sees is actually there. Unlike idealism, which questions and doubts that what he is sensing is actually what he is sensing. Now this idea of realism was started by Plato in the ancient Greeks, and later it was perfected by Aristotle, his pupil. Now, Catholics may not use Catholicism and revelation to build and found their philosophy, but they certainly use it to guide it. The truth of realism is confirmed in sacred scripture. Sacred scripture states that the human intellect is created in the likeness and image of God. And St. Thomas affirms that this likeness and image is primarily in the intellect of man. So when man looks at the world, he sees in an imperfect manner what God sees. So God has these ideas of a rock, a stone, a tree, of air in his mind, and he places them into the universe. This is called creation. When man sees the rock or the stone and the tree, he comprehends that same image that God put into them. So that image or idea first existed in the divine intellect. It was put into material being. And then through the human intellect, man abstracts it out of the material world, and that idea now rests in man's intellect. So man sees the world as God creates it. Now, because we see the world as God creates it, man can study nature, and he can understand many of the desires and purposes God has imposed on nature. This is the foundation for natural law. Let's take the example of bunnies. We can see that by the way bunnies are made, bunnies are meant to reproduce and create more bunnies. Now man is also meant to reproduce and create more man. However, bunnies were here to create more bunnies on Earth. Though man does create more man on Earth, he only creates man on Earth for the sake of populating heaven. Therefore, though man creates more man in a similar way to the way bunnies do, he has more moral obligations and ethical implications, because his job is not just to raise man on Earth, but to raise man in such a way that he will surpass Earth and one day be in heaven with God. Now, when we look at the history of philosophy in the Catholic faith, we have to start with the Church Fathers. Now, they were mostly Platonists. Now, Plato got a lot of things right, but he also had many problems. One of the big problems with Plato was he had this idea that the immaterial was good, and the matter was more or less a bad thing. And this led to this idea that the body was bad. Now, even some of the great fathers, like St. Augustine, who was both a doctor and a father of the Catholic Church, he had problems understanding the bodily resurrection because he was limited by the philosophy of Plato. However, eventually, the pupil of Plato, Aristotle, would find its way into the Catholic faith. St. Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas would take the writings of Aristotle in the Greek and translate them into the Latin so that the average cleric could read these writings and use it for developing their philosophy. These writings of Aristotle was taken by St. Thomas Aquinas and was used for the foundation of his theology. Through this writing of Aristotle as his philosophical foundation, St. Thomas became the greatest theologian in the Catholic Church. He was deemed the universal doctor at the Council of Trent. His great work, the Summa Theologiae, was placed on the altar before the council was convened. Now, Aristotle had some key differences over Plato. One of the big ones was Aristotle really had a proper understanding of the human person, of man, and of the human intellect. And one of the key differences was that Aristotle believed that the body and the soul were both good. And through understanding this, Aristotle actually had a proper argument for the afterlife, purely from nature, without any revelation. Now, Aristotle also wrote a book on the philosophy of nature called The Physics. And it is from this book, The Physics, that St. Thomas Aquinas was able to develop natural law. Now, from the writings of Aristotle and his teachings of the intellect, we can find that he knew many things that some moderns think they have rediscovered. One of these is Pavlov's dog. Now, Pavlov had this idea of classical conditioning, that you can train a dog to respond to a bell and it will start to salivate because it's formed a habit. However, if we look in the writings of Aristotle, thousands of years earlier, the concept of classical conditioning was already in the philosophical psychology of Aristotle. So, we see that there's great wisdom in the ancients. We must not neglect them because they're going to have a very important effect on the way we view the world. So after we have looked at the ancient philosophers and then brought it up to date with St. Thomas and how he has applied them into our life, our ethics, our theology, we need to examine the enemy. The enemy is what's called idealism. So unlike the realists, like Plato and Aristotle, who think what you sense is really there, that you're seeing this idea that was first created by God. The idealists have a very different view. They doubt everything. They doubt that we can really rely on our senses. They would say, though we sense things, we just kind of make those things up. They think the world outside of us is really chaotic. And when we sense color or taste or various things, it's merely our intellects attempting to make sense of the chaotic outside world. So when we form a concept of a dog or a tree or wood, this is not an idea that's passed from God to the material object to man. It is merely man that's creating this concept as an attempt to explain the external world. So when we now, under materialism, which is a result of idealism, there is no longer the immaterial. For realists believe that in the external world, in the real world we live in, all things have this immaterial idea from God, and they also have matter. But in the idealist, all there is matter. These ideas simply reside in our intellect. They don't exist outside of us. So now when we look at the world, we don't see a world that is created by God. We see a world that man has simply imposed on a world. When we study the nature of something, we are not studying the will imposed on a thing by God. We are merely studying the way man understands this external object. Because of this, natural law completely falls apart. All the modern notions of sexuality become ethically acceptable and reasonable. Now that we have this new view of creation, a new metaphysics that's based on materialism, creation doesn't really demand a God as it once did. Man, in a sense, has become the creator. Atheism is now on the verge of becoming a philosophically acceptable position. Now, this new philosophy is recognized as a danger by Holy Mother Chruch, and it was given the name of modernism by Pope St. Pius X. Now, when many of us think of modernism, we think of this idea that doctrines and dogmas can evolve with time. We apply it to theology. But we must remember that theology is based upon our philosophical understanding of the world. When Pope St. Pius X went to condemn modernism, he started off talking about the modernist as a philosopher. This was the foundation for the modernist theology. And what he talks about is the idealist. And we can see that he is implying the names of René Descartes and Immanuel Kant. And their philosophy gave rise to this really dangerous heresy that was really hurting Holy Mother Chruch. In the end of the encyclical, St. Pius X talks about how the solution to this heresy is Thomism. Not just his theology, but his philosophy that's based on realism. When we look over at the many of the popes since St. Pius X, again and again, they talk about how the philosophy and theology of St. Thomas is a bedrock and very safe path to properly navigate these murky waters. If we also as laymen want to fight against these many errors that have crept into even Holy Mother Chruch in modern society, we must begin the movement of studying philosophy and properly correcting our understanding of the external world. Learn philosophy and guard your faith.